The age-old controversy between children and parents go on and on. We seem to drive each other crazy. Why is that?
There are a number of reasons. I think probably the most obvious one is that we're different ages. Children have enormous energy. They can keep moving for hours on end. Yeah. They exhaust their parents. That's part of it. They aren't really terribly interested in making their parents happy. I think parents are much more interested in making the children happy. Yeah. But I think that's only part of it. I think one of the real problems is the fact that very few grown-ups, even if they're young parents, really remember how it felt to be a child. And a lot of the difficulties have to do with that lack of remembering. That some of the kinds of things that their children are doing are things that they did, things that they felt. Well,
let's break it down. Let's take, what kind of craziness can a 2-year-old create?
Oh, you really picked the crazy.
Just
that's probably the big, well, until adolescence, that's the biggest crazy, because here's this nice, amiable child who's been willing to put up with parental expectations and demands very nicely for about a year and a half, and suddenly there's this creature who suddenly has become, wildly rebellious. And I think this is very, parents get, their feelings are hurt. How could this lovely child have turned into such a monster? If they would understand that that is the most normal and wonderful thing that could possibly happen. I think it's like when an infant or a young child looks in the mirror and doesn't recognize who that person is in the mirror, and then after a few more months, aha, that's me. What happens at about the age of 2 is that the aha is now not only in the mirror, it's also, hey, listen, I'm a person. You've been pushing me around for 2 years. If I'm going to be somebody, if I'm going to be a separate person, this stuff has got to stop here. And so that's the time of the 2-year-old.
So they're laying down their charter for the next...
They're saying no to everything. Yeah. And I think if parents understand that it really is an act of integrity, it is saying, I am. And
well, you mentioned that this is the worst time before being a teenager. What actually happens with the teenager then? Isn't it the same?
It's the same sort of thing in a different way. I think it works its way up. I think middle-aged children in their the school-age level. It's the beginning of the peer group is more important than my parents. That's the first part. Then by the time they get to be teenagers, it's terribly, terribly difficult to move from being a child to becoming an adult, and that's what the teenager is dealing with. It's not only the hormones that are knocking them out and they're ricocheting from wall to wall because of the physical changes that are taking place. It's also that they have to have the courage to leave this safe nest, and the only way they can do it is to fight their parents. Yeah. So that the first years of adolescence are much worse than later on. 13, I think, is about the toughest time. When my daughter was 13, I wrote an article for Parents Magazine called The Year I Became a Monster Mother. She used to give me this look. It was like a death ray. And I felt if she looked at me directly, I was going to disintegrate. And by the time she was 18, we were wonderful friends again. Yeah. It's almost as if I have to show I'm growing up, and the only way I can do it is to reject my parents. And it lasts from about 14 to 16, and then they feel sure enough of themselves, so they begin to feel comfortable with parents again. They begin to come back. Yeah.
Well, parents, you mentioned before, we were all kids once. I don't share the knowledge you have about child raising, but parents went through it, and yet you wonder, does that help or does that hurt in the experience of relating to kids?
They went through it, and unfortunately, about the most important things, they repressed it completely. There's a lot of terror.
What does it mean to repress?
To push it down from your conscious into your unconscious, which is, it's a kind of metaphor.
Meaning you don't
It means you just don't remember, that you forget. And that the reason you forget is because there's an awful lot of horror in early childhood. I'll give you a quick example of, let's say you have an infant. It's your first child. The infant is maybe 2 months old or something. Maybe it's colicky. You feel as if you're the end of your rope. You can't listen to that kid crying anymore. You put the kid you put the baby in its crib in a room, and you go out of the room. And this is very often where we begin to get child abuse, because that mother may be absolutely shaking with rage. And the reason she's shaking with rage is that child is reminding her of a terror that she experienced herself when she was an infant. That when you are alone in a room and you are an infant, you have no sense of time. You don't know that sometime somebody's going to come and pick you up. You don't know what time is. You have no sense of space. You don't know that this black abyss you're in could ever end. You don't know there are other rooms in the house and that people are moving around in those rooms. That is a terrifying time of childhood. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that happens is that when a child behaves the way babies behave, it reminds us, it brings it back up to the conscious surface of our minds, and there is terror there. Another typical example is a mother who told me that her husband had screamed at the 4-year-old, "You're too big to have a nightlight." And she was very upset about that because she didn't think he was too big. And she discussed it with her husband, and he said, "Oh, I forgot. That's exactly what my father said to me. And I was so scared, and I haven't thought about it."
Which do you think is the toughest thing about being young?
I guess not being listened to. That it leads to a kind of loneliness, because listening isn't just sitting there listening to the words, it's listening to the feelings that are underneath it. And that's another time when I think it's terribly important for parents to try to remember how they felt when they were young, because I think what happens is they get frightened. Just as the earlier story about the mother with the baby who's frightened, she's getting the terror that the child feels. I think in adolescence, parents are so frightened that something awful will happen. And so then they can't listen, and they can't really reflect the feelings the young person is giving
Reflect
them.
the feelings is a key word. What does a parent do? Say something like, instead of responding to what their actual words are, you'd say, "You really feel strongly about that, don't you?" Or you feel very frightened.
You don't seem to understand how dangerous it is to go to such and such a party and drive home, rather than saying, "God, I remember when I was your age, it was so hard to try to be different from anybody else. And I know you have to really struggle with that. Things happen at those parties that I think probably scare you. And I know how you feel, and I want to help you in any way I can." To remember your own childhood, to reflect it back to the child, because I think one of the things that is, it causes loneliness. Nobody really understands how I'm feeling. They don't seem to get it.
Well, let's go back to feelings again. Feeling hurt or feeling angry. We all experience them, these intense emotions. In the next sequence, my friends talk about the things that evoke one of the strongest emotions, anger.
Well, people not trusting each other. Like friends not trusting each other, and like when they don't trust each other and they don't believe each other. And if they're really supposed to be friends, they should believe each other all the time.
You know, when people are thoughtless, it kind of annoys me when they're careless and stuff, and if you're doing something with someone, they don't like do their part, it kind of makes me mad because I think they're like thoughtless.
I don't like when people who aren't my mother or my father act like they are, tell me what to do, stuff like that.
What makes me most angry? That's tough. Failure. That gets me annoyed. When I do bad on a test or I get a bad mark, that gets me annoyed a lot.
I'm not exactly sure, but well, I see a lot of my friends, this one thing. I see them getting bullied by other kids, I just don't like it.
When my brother doesn't listen to me, when teachers yell at me all the time.
What really makes me angry is someone talks about me. I don't like that.
I guess it's important for the youngsters to express their anger. Are parents supposed to help them express their anger?
Yeah, what's so interesting about that? I had the feeling that almost everything they were saying had to do with anger at people who were not letting them be themselves. The teacher who yells, the friend who doesn't understand. In every example, I had the feeling that what they really, in a general way, what really angers young people is, are you seeing me as myself? How can I begin to be myself? Help me with this discovery of myself. And that anger is really the frustration of feeling that somehow others are not helping you search for that image. And of course, that is typical of that age.
It seems the struggle between a parent and a child is that the parent has some kind of an image. They see the child up in this direction and they see this behavior going in this direction. So immediately, there's an instinct to jump in and stop the flow.
At every age, we're talking about the 2-year-old rebellion, we're talking about adolescence. At every age is the need to be seen as I am, and the willingness of parents to let a child become the person he or she needs to be.